Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic podcast. Before I introduce my guest, allow me to announce that this podcast is now part of the Walled Garden Podcast Network, which is basically just a bunch of contributors with similar podcasts pursuing wisdom, truth, and the divine. And we all have basically similar missions, and so we're all coming together to share in that mission. It's a collective journey, and actually my guest today is Rocco Jarman, who is on that as well. Rocco is a poet, a philosopher, an artist, and a mindfulness coach. He hosts the Eyes Wide Open Life podcast, where he explores important questions about the human experience. His podcast, like the Strong Stoic, again, is part of the Walled Garden Podcast Network, so it's a very similar tone. In this episode, Rocco and I discuss the hero's journey, and I'll admit, we get a little bit nerdy on The Lord of the Rings. We also talk about the current mess that we're in, quote, quote, mess that we're in, and how we can possibly become more deeply connected in a world that is connected through things like social media, yet we still find ourselves somewhat lacking in connection. Without further ado, please welcome Rocco Jarman. So basically, today, just want to get into like the hero's journey a little bit. I know we've spoken about it quite a bit.
Yeah, sure.
You've spoken about it with Simon quite a bit on his podcast. And yeah, I'm just excited to get into it and see where we gel. So I guess what I'd like to start with is, actually, I'll start with what I said about Juan, because I just had Juan on the podcast. And you and I have worked together from an organizational standpoint for a little while now, but we haven't spoken about philosophy much to each other. So I'm excited to do that. This is kind of the Walled Garden series of podcasts at the moment. But so I want to talk about the hero's journey. And the reason why I want to raise this question with you in particular is because I've heard you speak about this quite a bit. And one of the things that I think you understand I think is like I do, is that it's a lot more difficult than I think a lot of people give it credit for. So my question that I want us to move towards today is, what would make you choose the hero's journey over just a regular life? And I have an example to get us started. There's a scene in The Avengers, I don't know if you've seen that, I know a lot of people have, where this was after Thanos wiped out like half the population, right, of the universe. So like everyone's kind of in grieving. But Iron Man got lucky. His wife didn't die, he had a child, he was living in the woods, and so, his life got affected, but he still kind of had this pretty good normal life. In a sense, it was better because he didn't have the stress of being a CEO and a millionaire, billionaire, trillionaire, whatever he was. And he had a choice to either basically risk his life and try and reset things and bring everyone back to life, giving the world back to what it was and happiness, presumably, or staying in his current life, which was still good. And he could have been happy. He could have lived that life probably for the rest of his life and been quite happy. Maybe we can debate if that's the case or not, but the question I want us to move towards is, how does someone make the choice, and of course he ended up dying, how does someone make that choice over living a regular, normal, quote, quote, happy life? But I'll let you get into it and see what comes up.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting and a great question. Look, I think ultimately, unkindly, it's a flawed question because he couldn't avoid in the end acquiescing to another quest or challenge. But ironically, part of it was for nobility, but part of it was to manage his own conscience in the losing of the younger kid that he had sort of initiated into that life. So he felt a responsibility that he couldn't atone for. Well, that was his way of atonement. So, which brings me to the second point, I suppose, is that a hero's journey isn't one and done. It isn't a whole choice in life. There are micro hero's journeys we can do at every single point. The full... I don't know if I subscribe wholly to these deep analyses when you see these wheels and they describe the hero's journey and they divvy it up in different ways, and some of them have a figure of 8 and some of them have sort of 3 a large hemi-quadrant at the bottom and then 2 left and right about return and separation and so on. I think different kinds of engagements and experiences have slightly different ways of slicing and dicing the hero's journey. So, of course, terminology we borrow from Joseph Campbell. And what he was trying to do, as much as anything, was trying to point out that there's a sameness in so many of our hero myths, and that there seems to be these repeated patterns or repeated pieces or repeated themes. What I personally am far more interested in is this choice of love over fear. And this is also so. We'll talk about that in a minute. But fundamentally, love would be. It's not a romantic notion of love. It's a philosophical concept of love, which is expansion, dilation, opening up, moving towards connection, expansion, curiosity. Whereas fear would be closing down, restricting, containing, moving away, the opposite of curiosity and expansion. And the opposite of love is not hate, it's fear, and then hate is then a product of fear, not the other way around. And if we keep that as our compass, we're trying. This now gets to the issue of what I really believe is at the heart of my philosophy, which is, what is everybody trying to do? We're trying to figure out which of the following two modalities or approaches is the most noble. Is it more noble to surrender with equanimity to what is, the way we are, the way the world is? Because there's an ability in that, and there's a courage required of us of that, which is an expression of love. And or is it more noble to strive against the status quo in the pursuit of something better or noble, either in ourselves or in the outside world? And often those two occur together at the same time. I mean, there's a change to the hero as they really invest in the journey, as much as the outcome that they eventuate for society or the village or whomever. And the answer, of course, is it's neither A nor B. It's both. It's neither acceptance nor striving against wholly. It's always variation and iteration of both. It's always a cyclic experience or seasonal experience of actualization and integration. And that really is the only way to achieve stable development and growth, is if you are actualizing for a time and then you take what you have now encountered and the way that you've flexed in the world and what you've changed or achieved, and then you integrate that back into either yourself, the village of your own psyche, or the village of your community, or the village of your family, or the village of your time. And we do this all the time. We strike out and we go against the odds, and then we achieve something, or we notice something, or these might not even be quests. These might just be these serendipitous things that arrive, like inventions or discoveries or knowings. But then tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, clank. There is a pendulum and a ratcheting effect. The ratcheting effect is once you've integrated it inside yourself, for better or worse, and it becomes yours and it becomes part of you, in which case you achieve a new static baseline, in which case you may become listening out again, or open to an invitation again for the new hero's call or the new adventure. Now, some people are on a very progressive arc upwards, but they're doing it in bite-sized increments. It's very rare. It's actually part of a misunderstood trope that we're all doing this one and done, that we have one dark night of the soul, that we have one ordeal that we have to face. We have many, many, many dark nights of the soul. We have many ordeals. And the world is changing so rapidly from simplicity to complexity that our opportunities for reaching these very complex bifurcation points of am I doing whatever I'm doing here from love or from fear? Is it apathy, or is it actual equanimity? And there's a difference between these things, and we can't always develop the discernment just standing at the fork in the road, choosing what we would, what is the right answer. And what are we all doing? We're all trying to avoid regret. So, in answer to your hero's journey, I think if somebody is committed to a life of growth or healing, and they can be two sides of the same coin, we invariably will be brushing up against the status quo, because you've heard me mention a few times that quote by Jiddu Krishnamurti, which is, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted in a perfectly sick society, or profoundly sick society. And so in a profoundly sick society, many of us are going to be seeking, are going to be at odds with status quos, are going to feel that what we're encountering natively and normally is, the normal is not good. And so we're invited either to fix ourselves in small, subtle ways, or we're invited to challenge a status quo, either within ourselves or outside in the world, or, as I said, both at the same time, which requires a lot of adversity, courage, letting go of close friendships. And let's say, for example, my interpretation of somebody's small hero journey is cutting off toxic people in their family. That does represent an isolation. It does represent a removal of safety, a social safety, and something that they've perhaps enjoyed their whole lives. And they have to then go out into the wilderness and find a meaningful, authentic substitute for that connection out in the world. And it's going to mean that they are now vulnerable to being challenged for whom they are without the sanctuary of their community or their village. And they might find a friend along the way, they might find adversity along the way, and the adversary that they find is often their own ego. Mm-hmm. This plays perfectly into the hero's journey. So why would one choose this? Because discomfort is the only cure for apathy. Adversity and trial and is the only pathway really for significant growth. Because what we're doing really is we're threshing the wheat to get at the kernel. I mean, that is what actualization is. It's getting to our essence, and that takes agitation and the metaphor of adversity. And as the chaff breaks away, it's that learning and that discovery and that pain that the chaff. We are not the whole chaff. The chaff was just a shell that protected us for a season, and life is a series of these moments which will come and undo us in order to build us back up. Mm-hmm. And it's how we submit to those, I think. Now, what would a life look like without choosing that kind of heroic courage? And I don't mean heroic in the naive, childish sense of the word. I mean it here as in the will to love over fear. Well, in the pursuit of authenticity and integrity, yeah. So, well, that's a long-winded answer, but
no, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to unpack there. I think I've heard you mention Lord of the Rings before. I think you're familiar with the story in general.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Okay, because there's something that strikes me as fascinating when you were talking about that is, when I look at something like, say, the archetypical hero story, I look at someone who has had to sacrifice a piece of himself in order to do such a thing, right? And you see that with Frodo, for example. So maybe what we can get into is maybe like the difference. You look at someone like, okay, well, let me just briefly sum up. So in Lord of the Rings, you have this basically the safe haven, right? Which is the Shire. It's like everything's perfect, and you have gossip and stuff, but Frodo has to leave to go on this really, really long journey where he confronts evil, he confronts all kinds of ordeals, and has to come back to this state. And so this is very common where you see people that grow up in their community and their family.
But remember, just one quick thing, he was confronted with real present danger. Mm-hmm. He didn't choose a hero's journey, he evaded death.
Yeah.
Which
in
is
Frodo's case
slightly different.
Yeah.
Later on, when he's at the council and he then is truly safe and someone else can take on the charge, then he levels up a second time and he chooses adventure we chooses the quest. That's the moment of choice, not running away from danger.
Yeah. That's a very important distinction. Um, but what's fascinating to me is that okay, so you have Frodo, and he goes on this journey, and he actually got scarred in the first part of that journey. So again, you said he was running out of fear, and he got permanently damaged from that. He got stabbed,
That's
which was a
right.
potentially
That's
mortal
right.
wound, and he goes on the whole journey, and of course it was just obviously unbelievably difficult. That's the whole point of the hero's journey. It's something that is difficult, but when he comes home, when him and Sam they finally make it home, they're not the same. Now, this is fascinating to me. This is what I realized. I didn't really put this together until I heard you talking here, but they're not the same because Frodo is home and he is scarred, and he has to go off to the safe haven afterwards, somewhere away from the Shire, because home is no longer home for him. He's evolved. He's had to
That's right.
sacrifice a piece of
That's
himself.
right. That's right.
Now, Sam is able to come home, get married, have children, live a normal life, but he
Correct.
went on quote quote the same journey. Now, of course, it's not the same
Yeah.
journey.
Yeah. He did and he didn't. Yes.
Exactly. So, I'd be curious to kind of help. Maybe we can dissect what the hell is the difference there. Why
Sure.
is Frodo one who is, and they're both heroes in our minds. I mean, I consider Sam a hero. I'm sure you would
Of
as well.
course.
But one is damaged. You cannot repair that damage. It's permanent. While
Sure.
the other one is not.
Sure. So it gets at, when I talk about love versus fear, there's this beautiful uh, idea that I've floated, which it just works. And it's the question that one asks oneself: what does love look like right now? And sometimes the answer is defiance, sometimes the answer is acquiescence, sometimes the answer is speaking up, sometimes it's being quiet, sometimes it's saying c'est la vie and equanimity, and sometimes it's going to hell with that. No, I'm going to do something. And not only is it subjective to the moment, it's subjective to the person to the moment.
Yeah.
Because what courage looks like for each of us, what the requisite ask of us we should be or are expected to make, is part of a conversation we are in all the time. Well, some of us are not in it yet, which is, I suppose, what I'd like to talk about when we get there. Is for these two characters, they were somehow in the conversation, and what they were in the conversation for was love. So what spurred Frodo on his choices was nobility and endurance, which is a kind of love if done for the right reasons. And for Sam's, it was companionship and stewardship of his friend out of love. So, but which he executed flawlessly, for which there were no wounds. The only wound he has, which is betrayed in the same story, is the wound watching his friend never being able to heal. And he has such great love
Mm-hmm.
for that friend, eventually he chooses to depart with him, even from his family. Now, this is of course allegorical, and what it is about is spiritual and mystical attainment beyond the realm of normalcy, or what is normal. And what it is actually an allegory of is Frodo chooses to follow the path of the gods because his soul is sick or unwell or can't heal fully where it is, which means he belongs now to another place. And because of Sam's love for Frodo, he chooses to follow even though he knows not the way. So he's like the Parsifal in the Grail story. Yeah, so
Mm.
what's the difference between those two kinds of heroes? And how does this happen? Well, we're all having subjective experiences, completely subjective experiences. We have our own predictive models in our heads. It's how we're not really interacting with each other. We are hallucinating this experience, you and I. I am receiving audio signal to my ears, visual light signals to my eyes. They're being converted to electrical signal, and I am hallucinating the entire experience. In fact, I do not even know what words and punctuation will end the sentence, or if I'll fumble over my words or not. I'm just sort of arriving there as, I hear myself I learn what I think as I hear myself speak. And I am not a contiguous perennial thing. I am a verb, not a noun. I'm constantly changing. What I ate
Yeah.
last night, the amount of sleep I had changes me. Whatever I looked at on the screen affects my priming and framing. The part of my book that I'm working on, the last podcast or conversation I was on, informs the questions I'm asking or the way I'm answering it, the language I'm choosing. And we know that's true. We know that's true. But yet we have a sense of self. And it's that sense of self, that thing that pulls us and says to us, this is right in this moment and this is wrong in this moment. That is the very quiet little canary in the mine that will eventually become the roaring voice of our own, the quiet voice of our own actualized self. Because we're becoming a self on this path. This is not a path of surrender, as you might find in the Eastern contemplative tradition. What I'm following very privately and what I'm leading others to is a path of self-actualization, which cannot be described by dogma or a tome of somebody else's thoughts. It has to be finding ways to come into contact with that very small, very subtle inner voice that is the one that informs our conscience one way or the other and makes us choose at these bifurcation points or paths what we define as love or as need in the moment. And that's actualization. And
Yeah.
if you look at every branch on a tree, it's growing in a similar way, but it's not going the same way. Some of them end before others end. Some of them strike out and reach for the top. Some of them reach out. They're each perfectly doing their own thing. No one can say this is a good branch and that is not a good branch. But they both, branched and forked, and there's straights and forks and straights and forks and straights and forks. The pattern will keep repeating. But every time they fork away, there is something that is individualizing from the group, choosing its own thing, which may eventually, in seasons to come, bear a fruit or, release a seed that will become a whole new tree. I mean, everything is following its own innate path. So there is this sense of Tao or Tao in it, but it's not the sense of release, as in, I'm just going to get out the way here. There is no self. It's not me. That sense of self is something we get an opportunity to build on and become a character and become an identity. Now, the trick is to do that in the service of nobility. So, as the difference to Sam and Frodo, they were just different archetypes. And they had,
Yeah.
yep.
Well, no, well, just gonna say is like, because what's interesting about these people, I see what you're saying there. It's almost like they were completely different.
Correct.
Like they weren't the same. So the essence of who they were, but also, it's kind of re-emphasized through the whole story that this is a burden that only Frodo can carry.
Which is
It's
made
a
up.
burden that only Frodo can carry.
Yeah.
Now, what I find interesting though is that, because I think about, okay, well, what is able to damage someone like that? And part of this, I think, is kind of like the idea of Christ and the cross, which is kind of very, very similar archetype, right? If not the same. But, Frodo had to carry the burden of evil, the literal burden of evil. The ring represented the great evil in the world. And so he had to carry that. And through carrying that burden, of course, that's going to well, very potentially and probably damage you throughout the journey. But it almost reminds me of something that Peterson says pretty frequently, which is, like a good man is not a man that is not capable of any evil. He's a good man that is capable of evil, but then chooses not to. And if you look at Frodo throughout the whole story, he sort of has access to this ring, this great evil. He's carrying it in a sense within him. It's on him, but it's more psychologically. It's within him, and choosing, for example, not to use it to go invisible, to get away from danger when he can. That's a very dangerous thing. Choosing to keep his distance, choosing not to let others carry that burden for him. These are all little choices along that journey that, of course, for him and his situation is virtuous, yet damaging
Yeah, but
because
yeah,
it's evil.
yeah, it's not all virtuous though, because he's a complex character. Because some of it's covetous.
Yeah. Well, that's and you see that you see him struggle with this, and he sees Smeagol, which is of course a person who has went through a very similar thing to
That's
him,
it.
without the quest of nobility, but he carried that evil burden, and it made him evil. And this whole journey, he's looking at Smeagol, thinking, "Well, holy
Yeah,
shit!
but for
Here's
the
this
grace of God
character.
go I. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
can I make my way back as well?" And you see him; he snaps. He has these instant, which we all do. We have this evil manifest itself in our day to day life, and but when you've seen someone go through what you're going through, like Frodo was able to see Smeagol or Gollum, however you want to say it,
Mm.
it is the question.
Yeah.
Well, if he went through that journey, and I'm going through that same journey, or at least a similar
Will
journey,
I take a
am I going
different
to
form?
wind up like
Yeah,
him?
will I take a different
Exactly.
bifurcation point? So, here's the thing I'd like to bring up, Brandon. Like, I mean, we're gonna sound like a Lord of the Rings podcast soon, but
Let's do
it's
it.
fine. There is a utility in exploring these archetypes and their story arcs, and there is a limit to that utility. And we cross over the boundary without noticing, and this is where our investigation or our comparison becomes counter intuitive, or it remains intuitive, but it becomes counter helpful, counterproductive. And this is where the line is. If I had to analyze what was actually happening in both of those characters with all their complexities and all the rest of them, and you add Smeagol into the mix, the Gollum character, and then you tack this on just to normal sort of hero tropes, hero archetypes, we can have a grand old time. At some point in time, we need to understand how the rubber hits the road for us in our daily lives. So I'd rather go straight there and then pull it back. And to go straight there is to start asking questions about the kind of evils we face, the kind of ways we slip and fall, the kind of battles we need to do. And Tolkien is playing with themes in different characters. And he's playing with insights into psychology that he wouldn't have clear windows into. He would just have his own intuitions, very spiritually informed, very Christian informed intuitions, right? Because it's ultimately a Christian allegory. But what is happening if we encounter a scenario like that? We are not walking into Mordor. Very few of us have those kind of burdens on our shoulders. We're not carrying a ring made by the Dark Lord. These are tropes which lend themselves to a very Christian view or paradigm of the world, which is something ultimately, I believe, also a myth, a fairy tale that we need to grow out of. And the real utility now for the arc of evolution of human thinking and understanding is to transcend the fairy tale and get underneath at the grit. What, if anything was true and anything was appealing, what is it and how does it apply to modern standards without believing in Iron Age mythology? And this is really the realm of psychology. It's what experience is this person having, and how is this experience that they're having relating to their understanding and the alignment of their predictive model to the actual reality of the world. That alignment is what we're trying to achieve, which
Right.
allows us the
Yeah.
perspective of understanding we actually are worthy, of we actually have a duty of stewardship. When there is great alignment with the actual truth that is out there, in automatically when your predictive model is aligned with that, you have a harmonious existence with that. But you also get called invariably, and this is not a side effect of nobility or altruism, it feels like sanity. You get called to generosity, compassion, accountability, these sorts of things, because it feels wrong not to. We've spoken about um, the character in your Dostoevsky book. We've spoken about, which reminds me of The Picture of Dorian Gray, um, that novel about the man who's extremely decadent and his picture gets uglier and uglier, which he hides away, and he remains perennially beautiful, even though he's corrupt on the inside. It's a beautiful idea. Um, we have all these puritanical overlays from society. We have all these virtuous overlays of what a good man should be, but they're all skewed at the end of the day. So one person's hero journey might be confronting their own inequity as measured by the bar of society, what society calls virtues. But if what society called virtues and accepted as virtues were actually virtuous and got us across the finish line, we wouldn't be in this mess. So there's something else, which means they are suffering a collective distortion of their predictive models. They are not in alignment. Certainly the way that we confect our interpretation of democracy or capitalism or journalism or social media or interaction or family values, the way that we are exercising this is all done in the service of fear, not the service of love. We are doing this in the avoidance of shame, in the avoidance of guilt, the avoidance of culpability. We want to be good so that we don't feel that our position of belonging will ever be compromised. We want to belong to the whole. But we've been infected with a lot of mind viruses. Now, if we try and track something as nuanced and complex as The Lord of the Rings and all the idiosyncratic foibles and flaws and virtues and how that ebbs and flows through the story, either in this kind of seasonal ebb and flow, or as you say, in these shocking moments of trial and decision making, it's going to be so hard to track what we experiencing as a human existence or a human experience, or our invitations into something approximating a hero's journey onto that, and then making sense of it. I think we're adding a layer of complexity which is going to stop serving us at some point in time. Whereas there is no dark lord. To pick up what Simon and I have been talking about recently on the walled garden, is this idea of pronoia, the not a naive belief that everything will be okay, c'est la vie. It's more a case that ultimately there is a will, a force, a power that we are wholly subject to, being part of this universe, that has meaning, at least, and is not all just out to get us, or not just cold and indifferent and meaningless. Now, one of our invitations, one of our hero's journey upgrades, is to start gaining the perspective that our drama of here and now, our adversity of here and now, what we perceive as our inadequacy of here and now, is a lack of perspective, not a lack of adequacy. Because if suddenly somebody told you that, and convinced you adequately or compellingly, that the project of everything we're doing with Stoicism, with Eastern contemplative tradition, with the project underneath Christianity at some level, was how do you get everyone to belong, capital B, belong. What's my pathway to belonging? What's my pathway to feeling self-redeemed, or an earned redemption? Or now the idea of a scapegoat and the idea of a redeemer are just two mirror images of each other. The one is some great noble other that's going to come along and rescue and redeem our wretched selves, throw the line of redemption from the outside in and rescue us, and entreat on our behalf, and settle the debt of our iniquity, our sins, our lack of worthiness, whatever it is. The trope of a scapegoat is to take something and pin all of our unworthiness, our shame, our scorn onto a thing and then drive it out into the desert into banishment. They're the same thing with a different, it's either a hero or a villain. And so this now becomes the central essence of our heroes and our villains. Either they're, yeah.
Yeah, no. So there's a lot to unpack there. So I would agree with the archetype. I think sometimes we can get a bit too bogged down into the, let's say, understanding some of these stories, which I tend to do. I do think that a lot of times these archetypes are archetypes for a particular reason, and it's because so many people sort of experience a lot of these
Of
things. But
course.
it does require a lot of, I suppose, understanding. And one of the things that I think a lot of people, myself included, when I was a kid looking at these heroes, there's a disconnect between the respect you feel for a hero and how it feels like to actually be a hero. And I think that there's a huge disconnect there. So I would agree and disagree. I think these archetypes are really important to understand, and I know you agree with that. But ultimately, we need to get down to where it hits the road. I wanted to back up a little bit though, because you spoke a little bit there about sort of the mess that we're in, and I have some, I have some idea of what you mean by that. But I wonder if we could just really define, like, if you were to say what's the, and really this is what the Wall Garden as an organization is trying to
Address.
go
Yeah,
after.
yeah,
But address, what is the mess that we're in, if you had to sum it up?
yeah. Yeah, sure. So it's the result of introducing. So there's a saying that I coined, which goes, systems fail when their inputs exceed their throughput, which is perennially universal for biological systems, psychological systems, societal systems, mechanical systems. A system will fail when its inputs exceed its throughput. And we fell in love with systems a while ago. We crossed a threshold. It was way after the agrarian pivot, but that's where the problem started. When we settled down as nomads and we chose an agrarian life, we became sedentary, we started protecting our crops, and then we had to invent technologies, ways of thinking, systems of collaboration and engagement to cater for population explosions, larger groups of people cohabiting in one place than used to be. We had to figure out how to moderate for disease and pestilence, how to keep clean, how to bring in running water, how to moderate laws and civil order, which would never have been necessary. We had to invent things and discover things. And what we did is we fell in love with systems. And we have multiple systems, and some of them become quite complex. They have entire ideologies wrapped around them. Ideology is an explanation of how to configure your predictive model, because this is the way it aligns with what we believe is the truth about the world. That's how we arrive at capitalism or communism or democracy or Christianity or anything. It's a oligarchical extrapolation out into the people to say, this is what you are supposed to think and believe, because if you all think and believe this way and you act this way and you consider these as your virtues and these as your sins, then we're all behaving consistently and therefore we can cohabit meaningfully. And the result of that has been two things. It's been a march from simplicity to complexity, which we're not authoring, we're arriving at as it eventuates. We're not doing it consciously. Cities don't grow consciously, they grow organically until they hit the bounds of what they can contain and they begin predating on themselves, or they schism and then go fight with the next village. Now, that concept of schisming is a natural response. An ant nest gets too big, it'll turn into two ant nests. Yeah. A city gets too big, it'll either begin to predate on itself, or the village would, somebody said, my child died from eating your fish, Jeff, and Jeff is the fishmonger. Then this political drama comes around now, because there are people that side with Jeff that say fish is not dangerous, and there are people that side with the daughter of the carpenter that died from eating the rotten fish. And ideologically, a few scenarios might happen. Everybody agrees with Jeff, and then they banish the other guy that blamed him for rotten fish. Everybody agrees with the carpenter, in which case they banish Jeff, or they split 50-50 and they turn into two villages. This is life. This is these bifurcation points. These are the ways that society are actualizing, but not consciously. So we grow bigger without planning, and then we schism or terminate or variate without planning. And the second thing that arrived was specialization. Because now with all this free time on everybody's hands, because the amount of effort and time to gather grain and provide water, when you implement your systems of storage and distribution, requires less effort than the sum of its parts. Because two people require double the effort if they're each individually fetching their own water, but three people don't require 3 times the manpower. They require a third of the manpower or half of the manpower. So it's more than one person can do on its own, but it's definitely less than it takes 3 to go do the same thing. For 3 to go chop wood, for 3 to make their own shoes, for 3 to raise their own apples, for 3 to milk cows. And in this way, we developed specialization. The guy that was the milker of cows, or the guy that was the maker of shoes, he passed that skill on to his son. They became curious. They had no other avenue in which they could actualize. It wasn't through philosophy or anything else. They just became ever better shoemakers. In fact, they became competitive because as the cities and societies grew bigger, it was incumbent upon me. My own hero's journey would be to travel to another city, apprentice myself to some great shoemaker so I could come back and be the best shoemaker in the area and inherit all of so-and-so's handcrafting skills. We got these systems which then became more and more complex as the societies became more complex. We have specializations which gave rise to inventions. And now people had more idle time on their hands, which means they had more time to invent things. And in the beginning, the first time somebody invented gunpowder, it was black magic. Now it's democratized technology. You can get it at a Walmart. In the same way, is nuclear fission was something that took the Manhattan Project years with the budget of an entire nation to do. Now it's something that university students can cobble together in a weekend. Now, that is part of the problem we're in. We have arrived at this place unconsciously where we've exceeded the bounds of the womb, either of the village, of the city, of the country, and now we're at civil war status on a societal and a national level. We're trying to outgrow our old orders that kept us controlled, safe, managed, but we're not exceeding their bounds consciously. We don't have a better solution in place for whatever is breaking now will be replaced with. We are too distracted to notice that there's a problem. We are sitting too close to a television screen to see the big picture. We have no discernment between cause and effect. We just have what our very busy, distracted, overwhelmed, predictive models are telling us are the causes and effects of things that go wrong. And we are stuck in a paradigm of binary thinking where somebody is going to be a redeemer. Jordan Peterson, it's Jordan Peterson. Everything he says is going to save us. Or it's Elon Musk. Everything he tweets is profound. He's a redeemer, or it's a scapegoat. The other. The guys with the red ties, those fools, those idiots, those snowflakes, those incels, those reprobates, those deplorables, they. We are all somebody else's they. And the intersectionality of who's this and who's they is so overwhelming, we can't easily discern between us and them, between self and other, between what to natively trust and feel safe and what to natively fear and feel threatened by. And our amygdalas, our fear response is hyperstimulated. Vigilance does not just come offline by itself. It remains activated once aroused. It doesn't only acquire valid targets, and so everybody has a hyper-aroused vigilance, an overwhelmed cognitive processing apparatus, social systems which were created in simpler times, in quainter times to field much smaller storms. And we have a scenario now where not only is a forest fire coming, A forest fire is coming towards the village, and you go to your neighbor, but he's not interested in listening to you because you're a Democrat and he's a Republican. Or I saw the fire truck that arrived is a Republican fire truck and they're not LGBTQ sensitive, and I won't. We have reached that level of idiocy where we're partisan about our survival and about what's good for the whole, and we are now neglecting ourselves, we're neglecting our mental health, we're neglecting the state of the world, we are allowing species to die. There is petabytes of child exploitation material still doing the rounds merrily in a huge trade on the internet, a problem too difficult and too cumbersome legally for anyone to try and solve, too bothersome. The human slave trade is still rife. We are horrifically cruel to animals in our use of them as a food source. There has to be a more benign way of doing this. There has to be. And we're not interested in looking at any of those problems because we're aroused to a state of fear and survival for ourselves. And all of our systems we can defend and say they're the best, the cleanest shirt in the laundry basket, but they still need a wash. And our only method for improving is the one nature imbued us with, which is schism or self-predation, to keep the numbers down or to avoid conflict. So now we have a synthesized amplification of every single thing that is not great about humanity in a pressure cooker, getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and louder and louder and louder and more overwhelming with no real solutions. And even when someone arrives with a solution, the ambient temperature in the room is such that people now find a new thing to argue and fight and berate each other about. There is no healthy counter trigger. So this is the mess I'm talking about. And what's more, our systems are failing us because their inputs are exceeding their throughput. Our justice system, our election systems, our education systems, our healthcare systems, they are woefully, woefully inept. But we can't fix them because the person making the recommendation doesn't wear our color tie. Or somehow I'm going to infer new offense from this
So
because they're not using my pronouns. Or we're worried about very, very silly things. It's a bit like arguing
yeah,
about the serving heat of the roast pigeon as the Titanic careens towards the iceberg. We're just arguing at the wrong level of everything. And I just want to say one more thing. Sorry, Brandon, I've been rambling on a lot, but these systems that our darlings that are always going to save us, journalism, democracy, capitalism, these systems, free market enterprise, these systems, there's two kinds of questions in the world that are worth answering. The one is how to solve a problem. How to solve a problem. And the second one is which problems are worth solving. The challenge is that our systems, our darlings, our democracy, our capitalism, our free market enterprise, our isms, they are adept at how to solve a problem. But we have relegated to them in our unconscious distraction the first question as well, which is which problems to focus on solving. So the politicians release plebiscites and referendums about things asked in such a stupid way, you don't actually want any of these two choices. Both election candidates are buffoons. Buffoons! So we get given two shit choices and get sold the illusion that we have a choice. Or the things that we're inventing and selecting for via Instagram or social media or our gaming of our psychology, which is being done. These are not in the service of solving the most pressing needs of the problem, of the planet. They're done in keeping us more distracted and selling more shit, consuming more shit, getting more likes. They're meaningless. The problem is a lack of conscious engagement, conscious involvement, conscious stewardship, conscious awareness, self-ownership. I believe.
yeah.
There's a
There's a
lot.
lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack there. I'm gonna see if I can try and attack some of these points. So I think if I had to sum up what you were saying there is we have a psychology built on Dunbar's number, essentially. We have a
That's
psychology
it.
built on about 150 people,
That's it.
and we're in a world now that is hyper connected, and we're trying to make sense of this. We're trying to figure out how the hell we have a psychology, which we can't really change, and it's built into us. And as much as many of us like to think that we're in charge all the time and that we're very rational human beings, blah blah blah, we have an underlying psychology that at the end of the day is we have to contend with whether or not we
Sure.
like to,
And you're right.
whether or not we'd like to or not.
We can upgrade it, but you can only upgrade it can either be upgraded for you in a way that makes it more distorting, or you can choose the effort to upgrade it yourself and arrive at clear perspective, which is the point of philosophy and of mindfulness practices. Exactly right. So there are upgrades here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and there's certainly it's certainly not hopeless, because socialization does play a huge role, obviously, and there is that. There are ways that you can socially engineer, and even from a personal perspective, ways to deal with some of these mechanisms. I mean, here's a clear example. One of the ways that we've dealt with male aggression, which is an evil thing in human psychology, is by segregating bathrooms by sex, and so that has allowed us to sort of reduce some of that risk as a society.
Well,
but
it put the problem behind a curtain. It didn't solve the problem.
It didn't. It solved. I would say that it partially solved.
Yeah, definitely.
But
yeah.
But yeah, so I would agree with that. So we have a psychology built on small groups, but we are now in an interconnect in a world that is so connected to the point where we can't even fathom how much connection there is. We don't you cannot. Your tiny primate brain cannot even fathom what 7-8 billion people are like.
No, exactly.
Like that quantity of people.
Correct. We have
so now
terrible
all of a sudden,
intuitions for those numbers. Terrible. Yeah.
And so now we're at that place. And the other thing I would like to throw some perspective from an engineering perspective actually at this, because what you're talking about there, the sort of natural progression with our systems and how we come together and we grow as a population, and then we have things like democracy pop up and all these different ways of trying to, for lack of a better way of putting it, live together.
Correct.
Peacefully. Yeah. Something like that. It's sort of like this. It's a really hard thing to understand or explain, I suppose. But the way I'll put it is, there's things in engineering when you design something that, when you design an engine, for example, if you have an old engine, you can improve upon it as it is. So you build an engine and then you improve upon it. You add a turbo, maybe you clean it up, you replace some parts, that's better. But there's a certain point where, first of all, you start to get diminishing returns.
Correct.
It doesn't matter how much you upgrade it; it's not going to be any better. But the second, more frightening thing that happens is that you basically reach a point where it starts to become a hindrance upon itself. So the design that used to work now is at a stage where if you want it to perform better than it is right now, because the problem has changed or because you just want it to improve, you cannot do that without completely ripping it in half and going to something like a battery or going to upgrading the design. But you have to burn the damn system down before you can actually do that.
Now we're getting to heroes' journeys. Mm-hmm. Because society is built up of many, many individuals, each with overwhelmed systems that have been upgraded badly, upgraded clumsily, innovated clumsily. And the only way for us to move forward is for each individual to take a modicum of self-sovereignty, self-control, self-moderation, self-ownership, and allow themselves to be broken down and rebuild their predictive models up. Because you cannot fix the outer systems, you have to fix the inner components. We are the resistors. We are the resistors. So if you think of us as a circuit board, we are the resistors that are preventing the flow of signal or the flow of energy, because we are individually, collectively holding on to, can I swear on this podcast?
Oh, go for it.
We are holding on to fucked predictive models that cannot survive a clash with reality that we are facing day to day. So we have to submit ourselves to these undoings, these breaking downs, these letting goes of things that we thought were very precious to us, like the threshing of the wheat, because whatever we lose in the service of that pursuit was never truly ours to begin with. We do get to grieve it. We do get to grieve it, but where we're going, there are always costs. There can be no gift without a cost and no cost without a gift. There is always a gift and always a cost.
Yeah.
And the cost of the gift is some of us won't make it. You know, at some point in time, humans schismed away from what became chimpanzees and bonobos. It's not like there are no more chimpanzees and bonobos. They went their different ways, and nature had room and space for them both to survive. Sometimes species clashed and they didn't both survive. But sometimes they do. Now, that might be that a certain group of people become more evolved in their thinking, more evolved in their compassion, more evolved in their self-ownership, and some remain where they are, and the human race will schism. Because nothing can outgrow its natural boundary and just keep on trucking. Something has to give. Something has to give. And Dunbar's number, even if we evolve to the point where we can double that, or we drop the bar for what's socially acceptable in terms of connection down, we can triple that, quadruple that, whatever the case. There is still a limit. And I still need to be able to trust the people around me that I don't have to exercise my power in the service of my safety or my freedom, so that I can pursue my purpose. There's 4 things we want, right? We want safety and freedom and power and purpose. Our purpose is, and our power is unique to ourselves. It's not physical prowess. It's our abilities, our conviction, our whatever. It's personal, very
fortitude.
100%. It's just from us. But we do need to negotiate and broker freedom and safety from our communities. And at the moment, we are relinquishing all of our freedoms in the service of safety. And there are sociopathic brokers, they call themselves CEOs and politicians. They are slowly clipping our liberties under the sales banner of safety, safety, safety. If we have a anthropologist do an autopsy on the human race 1,000 years from now, if we survive, they'll look back upon this time and it'll be typified by the sins of man against man committed in the name of safety.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote by actually Dostoevsky, which is, "It's better to go wrong in one's way, than it is to go right in someone else's."
Exactly right.
And I think this clash is where we're struggling with, because I see this as well in Canada, where people are relying so much on someone in authority, place scientist, place politician, place government, to basically dictate and control, to limit their risk. Now, here's my issue with that. I think we have this ideological view that life can be riskless, it can have no risk. And it's I mean, at the end of the day, we're all mortal. Yeah. We're all going to die. And that's not to say that systems cannot control some of these risks, but you have to get to a point where you cannot get to a point where you've overstructured the system to the point where it starts to double back on itself and actually...
You mentioned exactly the same thing when you were talking about the engine. You can only innovate so far and then it becomes counterproductive.
Yes, and actually I see this a lot in safety, because so I'm an engineer, so I see this quite a bit, where you have things like, okay, hard hats in the construction sites, great move. Safety glasses, great move. Steel toe boots, awesome. And then you start getting into things like, okay, well, you need to put on this really heavy-duty harness in order to go up this 3-foot ladder. And it starts to become... or crawl through a tank, which is really tight with this harness on, because if you die, we got to be able to retrieve the body. The problem with that is that, so you're adding all this structure onto the system in the goal of quote safety, but it starts to double back on itself, because now you cannot be competent in your job because you are restricted by those structures.
And therefore impacting your safety. I know but it's not in anyone's interest to make prudent, pragmatic choices because they don't have the permission and they fear the reprisal if they are responsible because they have no conviction of self.
Yeah, and that's what
Yep.
Jocko Willink would. I can't. What's the term he used for delegating ownership? It's just not what he used, but it was something like that, where when you're a leader, you need to delegate down and put the onus on the individuals as opposed to taking it all for yourself. That he had a proper term for that, but I can't remember what it was. But I think that's where we need to.
It's something to do with delegation of autonomy or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's but it really gets down to kind of like this idea of extreme ownership as well, which is take damn control of your
Yeah,
life.
look, you know, I think there's a point there. And there's a few things I want to say. Number one, I'm not saying we shouldn't have systems.
Correct.
The answer to bad, overcooked government is not no government, it's better government at the right level, focusing on the right kinds of problems. Can you imagine trying to distribute pension the way we have a Reddit debate? Okay, so you need somebody who cares about the problem and can track the numbers, and that you don't want to privatize it either. I wouldn't want to be an old age person reliant on a private company trying to skim ever thinner and thinner and thinner so they could pass my stipend on to me. There's instances, let's say there was a terrible disease that caused your left foot to rot and fall off, and there was a cure for it. A government is the perfect apparatus I would want to distribute a cure for that. The cream, the ointment, whatever it is to put on my bum to stop the worms from eating my left cheek. Whatever it is, there are use cases where I actually want a government. Our capture by binary thinking is what is killing us, because somebody will hear that and they'll go, oh my God, he's advocating for big government. No, that's a lack of imagination. I am not advocating for big government. I'm advocating for good government.
Right.
There is not a hole in that design. What the answer is to what good government looks like, I don't know. But I'm prepared to ask the questions to get there. But to do that, I have to trample on your political toes, because the libertarians who want to just tear everything down, because they just want everything to just magically work by themselves, that cannot work. And the liberals who want to tear everything down, every form of control, authority, structure, because they feel marginalized in their preciousness. This is not going to end with one side winning and then like the Civil War and going, okay, it turns out slavery was bad, guys. Oh my God, of course slavery is bad. We should never have done this. We're not dealing with a profound moral issue. We're dealing with very rabid ideological issues that have no logical conclusion.
Mm.
The problem is binary thinking. Nobody is inviting the third transcendent perspective or the lower fundamental to emerge, because we're sitting in polarized camps. Now, the property of a magnet is if you add charge to the one pole, automatically ions are going to flow to the other pole to balance the magnet out. The more energy you give to one side, the more you hate on the enemy, the more they'll hate on you. The more low shots you take, the more low shots they'll feel authorized and justified to take. I mean, it's a race to the bottom.
Mm.
And we still are stuck here. Intelligent human beings are stuck thinking that if I pick a side, somehow this is all going to work out. It is insane.
Yeah.
We have a virulent virus of tribalism, vigilance, and insanity, which has captured us completely. Tribalism is a natural property, a tendency designed to achieve connection in the service of survival. It is getting us divisiveness with the absolute certainty of self-annihilation. You add democratized technology into this mix, you add our trust, our daft trust in systems which are overwrought and overreached into the mix, and it's all going to end badly. And the only thing we have left at our disposal, there is great hope, because we're also hugely empowered right now. We're also have very evolved understandings and evolved relationships with technology right now. Our means to collaborate, our means to cooperate has never been this powerful. Our willingness, however, is what we need to bring along for the ride. And to do that, we need to fall out of love with systems and in love, again, with philosophy. Because philosophy is not designed to last, it's designed to change. And the reason our systems are failing us is because they each foolishly get designed to last, as if the status quo is the only form of challenge or problem we're ever going to have. How can you embrace evolution if you design static solutions that require this level of argument and dissension to innovate and improve? Can you imagine you were actually trying to improve an engine and everybody was screaming at each other, picking holes in each other's characters, instead of actually looking at the physics and the science of what it took to improve the performance of a said engine? Or engines exist to solve work problems, which means the engine isn't the only way to do it. There are other ways. There's other paradigms we've learned, like with call centers. What you're trying to do is you have to pay for every single seat that mans the telephone in a call center. So what you're trying to do is deliver good enough service that nobody has a problem. So you want to fix your processes. Then you want to divert as much of the traffic to the possible as self-service on the web, which means you build a system once and then it solves the problem. People can solve the problems themselves. Empowerment. And finally, for the last Luddites and the ones with complex problems, you have a small call center. So you have siphoned the work in different ways with ingenuity and innovation, so that the same work is being done, but you've now democratized the work so that people are doing bits of it themselves. And they seem to fit it into their lives. In the same way, just this blunt binary thinking of the engine's either not working enough or I need to innovate it more is where our limitation of thought is coming in. We need to be prepared to break the engine right down, but we need to have plan Bs in place, which means we need to be planning alternatives alongside, in parallel to. Like cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is a plan. It's not well executed at this point, but it is ratcheting forward human thinking that there are now alternatives to seashells and paper notes and banks rubbing their hands together. We can see a future without them. The first iteration is not going to work. Our binary thinking will say, I'm so glad it's done with. Burn it all to hell. What a foolish scheme. Yes, the foolishness was greed that came along for the ride. Fear instead of love. But the idea, there's something there. Let's fix it. But what you're going to do is there's going to be lots of equivalents to cryptocurrency that are going to sort of have a few iterations in parallel while the system capitulates. And eventually, as our discomfort grows, more interest is going to be turning to the left or the right. Maybe I should invest in solar. Maybe I should invest in wind. Maybe I should invest in geothermal, because this is getting too hard. Nobody thought we could work from home until COVID hit. Then when they wanted us all to work from home, suddenly, instantly, overnight, decisions were made that chief technological officers had dithered along for 10 years before that. And now suddenly, overnight, instantly, we can work remotely, and we don't have to take a plane trip everywhere, and somebody can actually complete their work from home. Just overnight, that happened, out of need. As soon as Ukraine was invaded, suddenly Europe started finding alternative energy solutions, or at least looking at them, miraculously. So the problem is when we get the timing wrong, and the calamity that arrives is of such a serious nature that we haven't got time to fuck around with a plan B, because the nature of the problem that arrives is too dire.
Yeah.
And we are squandering all of our time bickering and looking at TikTok videos and arguing about pronouns. And I'm not saying there's no victim there. There are people who are frustrated that their emotional needs or their sense of belonging in a world even though they feel different to a norm, is somehow compromised because people are insensitive to their needs or their own sense of identity. That shouldn't be right. Of course, you should make allowances, and everybody should feel comfortable if they're towing the line of civilization, of course. But what's now become a victim economy can also not be the answer. Because the pendulum never swings from the left and comes to rest neatly in the middle. It always overcorrects. With hashtag #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, the
Yeah, and
LGBTQ movement, these social movements needed to happen. But where they automatically go to is completely dysfunctional. And so they erode the merits of their own social cause by their overextension and their ridiculousness and the demands that they place on people and the accusations of privilege and implicit culpability on everyone that just walks past them. There is a place in the human heart that is so sensitive it cannot even suffer the affront of consideration, and that the present moment right now is the raw agitation of that nerve.
so, well, I suppose we got to come to an end here. I guess there's a lot. There's a lot there to unpack again. I like to make. I'd like to make some comments just to maybe sum up a little bit what you're saying. We don't want to burn the system down. Systems are not inherently bad. I think there's a balance between chaos and order, which the Tao's do for a very long time. Um, the problem with too much system, however, is that you lose the spirit. Right?
That's it.
You consider a body with too many bones. You can't move. You're not flexible, and so that's the problem with too much system. But I'd like to end with just very briefly here how people today can sort of fight some of this lack of connection. And I think this is important, and I've been struggling with this a lot myself in the last year or so. One of the things that I've done, which has been helpful to me, and I haven't done it as well as I should have, but I've been trying, is getting involved locally more in my community. And this is sort of counter to what we're moving towards now, which is everyone working from home. I work from home, but there's a caveat to that. And I love working from home, but there's a caveat. And the caveat is that I spend 75% of my work time not at home, in the field. So I'm not in an office. I have a weird job. But I think that in-person connection, personally, that's where I find the most meaning in my life right now. Now, there's the podcast, and I interview some people in person, a lot of solo episodes. Sometimes most of the time it's through the internet, which is fine as well. But I still find that in-person work environment crucial to meaning, and I leave those interactions just always feeling great, unless something terrible happened. So I think, like, for me, my input on how we can sort of fight this lack of connection, well, too much connection yet a lack of genuine connection, perhaps we can say it like that, is to get more involved in your community. Get to know your neighbors a bit better. Get to maybe even, like, as opposed to having all your meetings online, which we're moving towards now, invite your coworkers out for a beer. I think we're starting to lose that. I mean, I certainly see a lack of that now, post COVID. And I think that because I'm in a situation in my work environment where I'm kind of forced to do that anyway, I've really recognized the value because I can contrast it with people who don't get, like, any social interaction anymore. So I don't know, what's your 2 cents on that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think we have to select for as much of that as we can maintain. The problem for me is I highly value high quality connection, and I find low quality connection very draining. In other words, I live in a society where people will happily spend entire hours talking about sport and mortgages, which I find unstimulating. They can develop an emotional connection, perhaps, or intellectual connection, but it's not what I would call a real deep foundational connection. So I'm more and more forced to form connection, meaningful connection with people I can only meet virtually elsewhere. And so we're adapting as a species, and we're evolving as a species. I think we're losing some precious things, as you say, along the way, as we let the bathwater out. This sense of human connection and proximity and sharing and engagement is a casualty of that. The best thing I can say is um, if you're trying to rehabilitate a stray hound, a stray dog, it's frightened, it's nervous, it's coward, it's into a corner, it's prone to bite. If you can't tolerate a bit of discomfort, a bit of rejection, a bit of nips and snarls as the adult in the room, if you respond in kind to that dog, the dog will believe it will have its first belief confirmed that you represent danger and threat. So you need to, in the service of connection, be tolerant. Tolerance is the virtue. Tolerance is the virtue that says, I'm okay that my interactions with other people in the service of connection may be clumsy, may be uncomfortable, there may be an insult or an injury that I could drive out of this. But my tolerance, my predisposed intention to process this as consciously and as magnanimously as possible. That doesn't mean be a punching bag for somebody else. It just means a lot of disconnection happens from perceived injury, perceived insult, perceived wounding. And if we can discern between what is pain and what is injury, what is discomfort and what is actual loss, what is fear and what is actual danger, discernment. If we can develop our discernment, we can practice better tolerance. If we can practice better tolerance, we can forge connections that are resistant to forming because of somebody else's heightened fear, heightened vigilance, heightened tribalism. And the onus there on us then means consciousness is the tide that raises all boats, because the more clear we can become in ourselves, the more work we can do in ourselves, the less easily we will be triggered by somebody else's clumsy misstep that we will interpret as a deep political insult. Which means the more tolerant we'll be. And if this was a giant circuit board made of lots of resistors, what we would be looking for, the principle we would be looking for, is increased tolerance.
Yeah.
To discomfort, because people are relaying discomfort because they're in discomfort. And all it takes is a few movers to say, I choose to be a bit more tolerant. I choose to be a bit more benevolent. I choose to be kinder. I choose to be more self-controlled, because in that I'm relaying a more self-controlled signal, and I'm dampening the drama. I'm dampening the vigilance. I'm dampening the aggression. I'm dampening everything that we're trying to moderate out.
No, that's good. I would say that if you find something someone says offensive, consider for just a moment that maybe they weren't trying to be offensive. Consider for a moment that they actually have good intentions.
That's it.
Yeah, and maybe you're wrong. Maybe they have bad intentions.
That's it. And just take a breath.
Maybe, but
Correct,
it's worth
maybe.
considering at least that they have good intentions.
And there's a vault of advice in Stoicism that can tell somebody, even if offense was meant, sometimes it was childish offense and it was a first salvo, which you can still pull the situation and the relationship back. You always have more control than the out of control person.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Cool, man.
Hey,
thanks for chatting with me. We got into a lot of shit there, man. So, where can people find you?
My website is, obviously the Walled Garden. Brandon, we're both members now, contributing members of the Walled Garden. So thewalledgarden.com. I've got my own garden, my own contributor page there. I have a section called Following the Way with Rocco Jarman. You can find me there. On my own website, eyeswideopenlife.org. And my email, you can find contact details, email addresses, all sorts of things. I've got a growing YouTube channel, which is, again, Eyes Wide Open Life. And there's guided meditations, there's philosophy, there's spoken word poetry there. And I have a very active Instagram account where I post philosophy and quotes and little pieces of prosaic inspiration and encouragement. And that's at Rocket Sprocket. Instagram at Rocket Sprocket. And that's where folks can find me. And of course, I have my own
Correct.
podcast
Yeah,
as
your
well.
podcast.
Yeah,
I'll put all the links in the bio for those interested. And thanks again for coming on. And until next time.
I think we should have a
I
round
think we
two.
need it. All right.
Yeah, exactly.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, man. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.